All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the first of our, actually this afternoon, pardon, joining us this afternoon for our first session with the Art of Diplomacy 2016. We are so excited to be able to work with VIBE and with the Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater again this year to bring this wonderful program back to you. I am going to introduce our wonderful moderator for the session, Barbara Kustra. Barbara is the Suzanne and Bruce Crocker Director of the Montana Museum of Arts and Culture. She also hosts the Wednesday Morning Classics program on Montana Public Radio. Today's program will be recorded by Missoula Community Access Television. This recording is done as part of their media assistance grant that they have given to the Mansfield Center. If you would like more information, please visit mcat.org. Barbara, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. That's your mic. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased to have been asked by Charlene Campbell to my left to moderate today's discussion. She, of course, is the artistic director of the Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater. And this is going to be a very special discussion, I have no doubt. And the stories we're going to hear will be inspiring. It's really wonderful to be part of VIBE this year and their efforts to build cultural and diplomatic bridges through art and through all the arts. At the Montana Museum of Art and Culture, we collect, preserve, and celebrate art that expresses the spirit of the American West and how it connects to the larger world. We are both a university and a state museum, and we present exhibitions and educational programs that explore local, regional, and global themes. We love programs like this where we tie art, history, diplomacy, dance, music, and much more topics of international interest together, working with other organizations. Our permanent collection of art boasts nearly 11,000 treasures, and it is truly international in nature. We invite you to visit our galleries right across the hall from us here in this building during VIBE. We're currently presenting present tense prints from the collections of Jordan D. Schnitzer and his Family Foundation. And this features works by a number of important contemporary artists whose works feature the use of words, of symbols, of language, and marks. We've heard from viewers that it reminds them of being back in New York City or some other urban center somewhere in the world, and we're delighted by that. And we're thankful to Mr. Schnitzer for loaning us these excellent pieces of art. So do come visit. We're open till 6 today. We're open from 12 to 6 tomorrow, and then on Saturday, still during VIBE, we'll be open 12 to 3. And also, since today's session focuses on women, I want you to know that our next exhibition, which will open on January 26th later this month, and will be on view through May 27th, will specially feature women artists in Montana. It's called Intimate Wests, Women Artists in Montana, 1880 to 1944, and will feature women artists from our state. And in most of the cases, they are pretty under-celebrated. We want to celebrate them, much like we're going to celebrate Malvina Hoffman today. And so don't miss the Schnitzer prints this week and women artists later on. I want to thank our very special guest, Dee Dee Hoffman, for bringing the beautiful works of art with her for our display today and allowing us to create a temporary exhibition of works by Malvina Hoffman, Dee Dee's husband's great aunt, correct?
Correct.
Okay. A couple of these works also belong to Charlene, so I wanted to also offer some special thanks to Jeremy Canwell for setting up this short but wonderful show. I had the privilege in my career, before becoming an arts administrator, to be a professional musician. And in my mostly classical music career, as a clarinetist, I performed at the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and at Lincoln Center in New York City, among other venues, and had a real pleasure and honor to perform with some of the greatest dancers of the 20th century, including Rudolf Nureyev and Mikhail Baryshnikov, the Dance Theater of Harlem Dancers, Virginia Ballet, Washington Ballet, and others. I've played the Nutcracker Ballet more than 200 times, like most orchestral players in the world of dance, I suppose. I've admired dancers for a very long time and been part of the critical connection, I think, of music and dance. Now, as the director of a museum, I appreciate evermore the connection that visual artists make to artists of other expressions, as we'll hear a lot about today. So I'm now going to begin with a little introduction of Charlene Campbell. Carrie, that's her full name now. Artistic director, RMBT. She was born in Chicago and began her ballet studies with her mom, Elizabeth Gillette Campbell. Going on the train at the National Academy of Arts and later at the ABT, the American Ballet Theater, where she became a member of the faculty as assistant to director Patricia Wilde. Ms. Campbell's career has continued uninterrupted since 1976, during which time she danced at Radio City Music Hall, worked as choreographer for Chicago's Light Opera Works, spent 7 years as ballet mistress for the Hubbard Street Dance Company, and served as a leading dancer or choreographer for hundreds of ballets, operas, nightclub acts, and industrials. She has continued to coach, to teach, and to choreograph all over the world at institutions including the Broadway Dance Center in New York City, the Balletto di Roma, and the Corpora Choreographic Institute in Naples. In 1998, she opened Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater in Missoula, Montana, a place we all know pretty well. RMBT has over 50 original ballets in its repertoire and began touring internationally in '02. Prior to the '08 Olympics, Ms. Campbell led an RMBT delegation of 46 Montanans to Beijing, Guilin, Yangshuo, Suzhou, and to Shanghai as part of a 2-year project which produced the Montana program. She also proctored masterclasses at the National Ballet of China, and following the tour, accepted an invitation to return to China in October of '08 to participate in the Beijing Dance Academy International Ballet Competition. That's a lot of syllables.
Yeah, and Lu Bing is here.
Oh, wonderful.
It's amazing. That's where I met Lu Bing.
And she served there as a master teacher and coach. Dee Dee Hoffman. She's a writer and Malvina Hoffman's biographer. She's been writing since she was a young girl and is presently working as a copywriter and content manager for an insurance company in Florida, right? She majored in English at the University of Florida and also graduated with an MBA. She was awarded Distinguished Alumni in 2016 from South Plantation High School for marketing and journalism. Her manuscript, Malvina Hoffman Headhunter, is awaiting publication. She first saw Malvina Hoffman's work when she began dating her now husband, Chip Hoffman, Malvina's great-nephew. An art lover, Dee Dee could not believe she had never heard of America's Rodin, a woman who was a household name at her death in 1966. Dee Dee hopes to bring Malvina Hoffman back into her rightful place in American history and in art history. An integral part of Malvina's story is her relationship with ballerina Anna Pavlova, who was muse to the artist, and I think I'll leave it at that since you're going to talk a lot about that. Today's topic is how art promotes women and democracy. We will hear first from Dee Dee, and then we'll hear from Dee Dee and Charlene about the connection between them and between Malvina and some folks that Charlene knew, and Radio City Music Hall. And then we'll close with questions and answers and finish up around 1 o'clock. And from 1 till 1:15, 1:20, you're more than welcome to come and view these pieces of art up closely. So please give a warm, on a cold day, but give a warm Montana welcome to Dee Dee from Florida.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you all for having me here today and for coming to learn about Malvina Hoffman and Anna Pavlova. They're two women that I've grown to love deeply, and Malvina Hoffman, as Barbara mentioned, I had never heard of her. She was a sculptor, and she also was a force of nature. She lived a life that was huge, and her art was a big part of it. When she died in 1966, she was the front page of the New York Times obituary. She was so important to art and to adventure and to women, but she's now forgotten. I'm also going to talk about Anna Pavlova, and I'm not an expert in Anna Pavlova, but I do feel like I understand the relationship between these two very special women. And just to give you a little bit of background, Anna Pavlova, when she was born in Russia in the middle of winter, was born to a woman who was a washerwoman. She didn't have a whole lot of money, and her father, Pavlova's father, died when she was young. And when she was 8 years old, she went to the Mariinsky Theater and saw Sleeping Beauty and fell in love with dance and decided she would become a ballerina. Her mother encouraged her but didn't really think it would happen. But in fact, Anna Pavlova had so much determination and she worked so hard that she was invited to become a student at the Imperial Ballet School. She rose through the ranks so quickly that she bypassed the corps de ballet and eventually became a principal and one of the most important dancers for them at the time. Now, she was only 4 years older than Malvina Hoffman, but by the time the two women met, she was an international star in her mid-20s. Malvina Hoffman was born in New York City, and she came from a whole different world. Her father was a pianist for the New York Philharmonic, and she grew up in the music salon for all of New York. So she grew up surrounded by music, the best in the world, and opera singers and musicians, and they would come to her home to rehearse or just come together and play music and enjoy their time together. Her mother was a member of New York society, the old New York, and actually the one written about in The Age of Innocence, and we think Madame Olenska might actually have been her mother in some form. So because of this, she got to know many of the most important people in New York, the patrons and the great collectors of art around the world. So her friends' homes had Matisse and Picasso and Renoir and Rodin in their homes, and these people fell in love with Malvina. At about 8 years old, too, she started to show talent as an artist. She was a prodigy. And because she came from a home of artists, they encouraged her. Back then, let's kind of talk about what was happening when these women were growing up. It was Victorian times. It was the 1800s. And for many of the younger women here, I don't know if they really understand what that meant. It meant that women had no power, no authority. If they got married, they owned nothing. Especially in Europe, they didn't own their property, and sometimes they didn't have rights to their children. And also, when they were born to get married. That was pretty much their function, and then to have an heir. So Malvina began working as a young artist, and when she was 13 years old, a very important person in her life died and had committed suicide. And she was a young teen and didn't know how to express it, and ran to her room and took out some clay and created her first bronze. And in clay, she created Despair, and it was of a girl that was sobbing, weeping in her hands. And her father came up and saw what she had done, and he put his arm around her and said, "I'm afraid you're going to be an artist." So let's talk about these women and their lives together. See if I can do this right. Yep. So this story really takes place between 1910 and 1937. That's what I'm going to focus on. And there's many reasons for that, but it's the relationship between these two women which is the focus today. Now, in the early 1900s in Paris, many things were happening to change art in the performance arts and in the visual arts. It was kind of an explosion of change. They called it the avant-garde, and avant-garde means experimental, new, different. And one of the things that happened was two American women came to Paris. Loie Fuller, who was one of the first modern dancers, came to Paris and took it by storm with her dancing in the Folies Bergère. And I always mispronounce that, so I apologize. But she was known for having gel lighting, which was very new on stage, and she had these scarves that she would twirl around on stage, and it was very free, very different than anything else that people had seen. Isadora Duncan also came to Paris, and both women had a relationship with Rodin. Now, Auguste Rodin at that time was one of the most modern sculptors ever. He changed sculpture from classic and traditional to the very modern. Rodin was not popular for many years, and until he was the age of 50, his work was rejected by anybody who cared about art. And because of this, determination to create what he wanted, he didn't really worry about other people thought about him. He just did his own thing. And eventually he became known for his sculpture, which was very different than anything. So Loie Fuller was a dancer, and she and Rodin became friends. And they also became lovers. And he also became he went into business with her. She would bring back his bronzes to America and sell them for him, although he didn't really trust her with the money. So that didn't last too long. Isadora Duncan rented studio space from Rodin's studio. He owned a hotel called the Hotel Biron, and it literally was a hotel, and it was a center for the arts in Paris. And so Isadora Duncan's dance company worked out and practiced at his Hotel Biron. So in 1910, Malvina Hoffman had come to Paris at the urging of her patrons to study with Rodin. Now, Rodin was in his 70s. He was towards the end of his career, and he really didn't need to bring on a student. So when she knocked on his door as a 25-year-old in 1910, she was turned away 4 times. The concierge wouldn't let her in. He had a way with women, and this was a young, pretty girl, and she just felt that it was trouble. But Malvina Hoffman was pretty determined. So she knocked again, and on the 5th time, she refused to leave until Rodin met with her. So he came to the door, and she showed him her portfolio, some portraits of some sculptures that she had done, and he thought she was pretty good. But he was in the middle of talking about his artwork to some gentlemen, and he asked to be excused, and he went to a marble and started to explain to the gentleman a poem that was the inspiration for the marble, and the poem was a French one, and everybody was communicating in French at this time because it was in Paris. And he forgot the lines to the poem, and he became very angry. He had a horrible temper. And Malvina touched him on the shoulder and said, "Master, I know the poem." And he couldn't believe it, and he belligerently said, "Well, tell me the poem." And she recited the entire poem to him in French. And at that point, he became endeared with Malvina Hoffman and gave her the keys to his studio and took her in as a student. She went on until the end of his life to become his protege and his very good friend. So in the 1900s, other people were coming to Paris that were young and free in the art world. One of them was Sergei Diaghilev, and he was a Russian who was promoting dance and art, but he especially was promoting dance with his Ballet Russe, which started in 1909. And what he did was he brought the best dancers from Russia to Paris during the off-season to dance with his company. And he brought young composers and young choreographers and just kind of let them go. And names like Balanchine and Nijinsky and Claude Debussy, the composer, and were very much a part of it. As well as he brought in local artists like Rodin, Matisse, and Picasso to do the sets and the costumes. It was very creative, and Anna Pavlova was one of the dancers that was with the Ballet Russe. Now at this point, Anna Pavlova and Malvina Hoffman have never met. Malvina Hoffman had seen works of art of the ballerina and knew of her, but she didn't know her. And so she was very interested in meeting them. When she came in 1910, Isadora Duncan was no longer at the Hotel Biron, but Malvina Hoffman did get to know them and got to know all the players that were out there. The Ballet Russe really changed everything. As I said, Diaghilev took these classically trained ballerinas and dancers and gave them a whole new way of dance. Now, before the Ballet Russe, ballet was codified. So the women all danced in unison and wore tutus, and the men were kind of in the background. What happened with the Ballet Russe was the men were able to come and have center stage as well, and the costuming started to look like the characters of the actual dancers. So it was very different than what was happening, and Anna Pavlova was a part of that as well. In this slide, you can see Nijinsky in L'après-midi du Faun. And actually, this is a study of Nijinsky, but Malvina Hoffman had not met him. She was doing it from what she had seen. And Malvina did Nijinsky from the Ballet Russe, but it's interesting to hear the story of this particular ballet because it expressed clearly what was happening in dance and the performing arts. Claude Debussy created the score to this. And what happened was it was such a modern score that historians say that that was the line in the sand when music went from classic to modern. And Nijinsky choreographed the ballet, and it was about a faun who was flirting with 3 nymphs on stage, and the nymphs, rather than doing the same thing, some were flirting with him, one was shy, one was very bold. And as you can see from his costume, he barely has any costume on at all. So the costumes were really changing, and when one of the fauns dropped her, one of the nymphs, pardon me, dropped her scarf on stage, the faun picked up the scarf and went back to his lair and made love to it on stage. Well, Paris went crazy. It was a huge scandal. And they were closing down Diaghilev because not only was what he was wearing scandalous, but his performance was obscene, according to the locals. So Sergei Diaghilev went to Rodin and said, please help me write a letter to Le Figaro and tell them how great this ballet is. So Rodin, who, you know, loved women and thought it was wonderful, so he wrote a letter stating just that he thought it was fabulous, and he was explicit as to what Nijinsky was doing on stage. Well, now Paris went even more crazy, but they turned their anger towards Rodin. The L'après-midi du Faun ballet was kind of forgotten by the press, and so Diaghilev was allowed to continue his Ballet Russe. Rodin took a lot of heat for that, though. It was really bad. Anna Pavlova was a long way from the Imperial Ballet when she was dancing with the Ballet Russe. And one of the dances that she did was the Bacchanale. And a Bacchanale is where you have gleeful joy and frivolity, and it's a lot of sexual innuendo and very playful. In 1910, when Malvina Hoffman came to Paris, she saw Anna Pavlova dance the Bacchanale on stage in London when she was visiting with her mother. And explosions went off in her head. She'd never seen such power controlled and expressed as if a feather was on stage. And it blew her away. And this is what she said in her diary. For 2 nights, I've been out of my mind during the performances of Russian dancing by the unapproachable miracles Pavlova and Mordkin. It was at that moment that Anna Pavlova becomes her muse. Now, a muse is, I don't know if you all know what a muse is, but a muse is inspiration. And a muse is more than that even. It's actually a force of nature. It pushes the person that they are inspiring to become obsessed with them and to do everything in relationship to them. And I can say that because Malvina Hoffman was my muse, is my muse, and literally a day doesn't go by where she's not in the forefront of my mind that I need to be doing something related to her. And Anna Pavlova was that to Malvina Hoffman. During this time, Malvina Hoffman had not met Pavlova, and she was still studying with Rodin. She would be in Paris in the summers and New York at her studio in the winters. So while she was studying with Rodin, she began creating in bronze dance. When she first saw Pavlova do the Bacchanal, she actually went to every performance after that and stood at the standing room only crowds, pushed her way to the front with her sketch pad in hand and drew and drew and drew. So she really had immediately become obsessed. As she was working on the dance while she was studying, she also had other commissions. So this wasn't a full-time thing that she was doing with dance. She had other major commissions. She was becoming an artist on her own. She was earning money, and she was still studying with Rodin. But she, as she was working on this, and I've just lost my train of thought, I apologize, but she kept talking to Rodin about what she was working with, and she would show Rodin her work, and he loved it, and he said, what I really want you to do is go and study anatomy and dissection. He said, it's my greatest regret that I didn't learn how to really be able to show musculature in motion and on my bronzes. So every time she went back to New York for the next 3 years, she did go and study dissection at the Cornell College of Physicians and Surgeons. During this time period, and it's really from 1910 until 1914, Malvina Hoffman, again, like I said, was working on the dance. And she used models because she didn't know Pavlova and she had no access to get to her. And she created 2 groupings called Russian dancers. One of the Russian dancers that you see up on the stage, on the screen, is actually won first prize in the Paris Salon. This was a big deal. Rodin never won anything at the Paris Salon, and it was his greatest desire to win. And they always rejected him, but she won first prize. And it looks like a realistic sculpture. Everything about it looks realism. You can see the muscles in her legs, and you can see, you know, exactly what they look like. But this was a modern sculpture because it was one of the first ones that ever showed motion in bronze. So by the 2 dancers being a little bit off balance, you can feel that they're going to have some forward momentum. And the scarf that's flowing in the background is also very modern, because up until then, sculptors weren't really showing movement in clothing and things like that. Usually there it was draped. Usually when you saw any kind of dancers in bronze, they were posing rather than moving. And that's why she won first prize. So Malvina kept doing her thing, and Anna Pavlova now, between the years 1909 and 1914, was coming through a lot of changes of her own. She was dancing with the Ballet Russe, and Diaghilev didn't want her to dance the Dying Swan, which was her signature movement. And because of that, she was getting a little annoyed, because she wanted to have more control over what she was doing. And when she saw Isadora Duncan had her own company, it was the first time that she had the audacity to believe that she too could have a company. And by 1911, she had started her own dance company, which, let's remember, this is before women had the right to vote. This is when women didn't really work. Back then, men ran the companies, and they made all the decisions. So all of a sudden, you've got this young girl, she's not even 30, and she's having to manage a company of dancers. She has to deal with the receipts. She has to make sure they're all dancing, or else they're gonna leave her and find another place to dance so they can earn a living. So this young woman takes on a dance company. And as she's going to New York to perform in 1914, one of Malvina's patrons, Mr. and Mrs. Otto Kahn, happened to let her know that Pavlova was coming. Now, Mr. Kahn was the chairman of the New York Opera House, which is where she was going to be performing. So Mrs. Kahn came up with a plan. She decided to have a tea and invite Pavlova to meet Malvina Hoffman. And she was even more clever because she took Malvina's bronzes and put them around the room so that when Pavlova was sitting there, she was looking at bronzes of herself that Malvina Hoffman had done. It wasn't where they became best friends. It was an introduction. And Anna Pavlova was a little reticent because Malvina Hoffman was sitting in the room with her muse and pretty intense about her reaction to it. So this is what she said in her diary. The fragile, pallid sprite comes into the room, dressed in black, with fiery, flashing eyes, quick, unexpected movements, nervous, breathless French conversation, simple, real, inspired from within, a child of nature, a great artist. This is at once evident. I watch her as a panther might crouch in a thicket and watch a bird. Every gesture records its line on my sensitive plate. From now on, I must become a reel to register endless fleeting impressions and characteristic movements. So as you can see, Malvina Hoffman was really happy to see her and meet her. But I think Pavlova was maybe a little off-put. Pavlova was very protective of her image. Because she ran her own company and she was promoting herself, she wouldn't let anything go out into the world that she hadn't personally approved. She liked Hoffman's bronzes enough that she gave her 2 weeks of backstage passes. And Malvina spent those 2 weeks. Every second that the ballet was dancing, she was backstage. But not only was she studying the dance, but she was also drawing the sets and the lighting, and she was working on trying to memorize the choreography. In fact, even in her diary, she's got writings in Russian, so she's trying to learn Russian. So the two women are starting to talk backstage a little bit and get to know each other. Malvina Hoffman said this, I prowl about the shadows, keeping out of the way, but taking it all in, the air, the expectance. The scene shifting goes to my head like wine. The music and the dance thrill me. The beauty of the accidental groups, the tiny precious pictures made by her as she hesitates behind the wings to rub her toes in rosin and powder her neck. Here's one of the images of Pavlova. I'm sure you've all have seen it. She would actually cut down the shoe, the ballet shoe, to a point, so that in photographs, it looked like she was on a point. And so everything she did had purpose, and it was to create an impression that she was flawless. And I think it worked. So during those 2 weeks, the two women really did become friends. Pavlova realized that Malvina Hoffman was just as serious about her art as she was about her ballet. And in fact, she realized that Malvina Hoffman was self-employed. The two women during this time, 1914, were self-employed women and having to make a living. And they talked about that. They talked about everything. And Malvina Hoffman writes this, La Muse and I have many exciting moments of discussion, posing, criticism, instruction and dancing, the history of toe pointing, poise, rhythm, etc., etc. One of the things that Pavlova did best was tell Malvina how to make her drawings better. And Malvina, being an artist and wanting to grow, took her criticism very seriously. She wanted to get it right, and Pavlova wanted her to get it right. So it was a really good collaboration. Malvina drew thousands of pictures while she was doing this, really legitimately thousands. And she lamented in her diaries, oh, to have the power to draw swift, clean, expressive lines. Degas could immortalize these scenes, but I must make 1,000. Now, I don't know if Degas could do it in a few lines, but Malvina felt he could. So she was feeling that she wasn't quite up to snuff at this point and wanted to work even harder to get better. After Pavlova left New York and went back touring, and she toured all over the world, she had to keep her company going, Hoffman went back to Paris. And during this time, where she wasn't with the ballerina, she started to come up with some other ideas. And one of them was called the Bacchanal Frieze. And it was a bas-relief frieze of the Bacchanal dance. And a bas-relief frieze, I'm sure you've seen them in stone, on buildings many times on the side of the building, they'll show a story that's done into the stone. And Malvina wanted to show the dance in clay of the Bacchanal. And so she showed her ideas to Rodin, and this is what Rodin said about it. There, that is beautiful. There is great quality in it. It has something of antiquity. There is nothing more beautiful than that. Look, the outlines are drawn and felt like the decorations on a Greek vase. It is very well done. Strive to feel in your frieze the rain sense of decoration in black and white, and you will succeed in creating a thing of real beauty. Oh, you can't see the bottom of the slide. I apologize. So that was in 1914, all of that happened. In August 1914, something else happened while Malvina Hoffman was in France. She was actually working with Rodin at the Hotel Biron, cataloging all of his works with him. Because when he had it willed that when he passed, that the state of France would take over all of his works and it would become the Musée Rodin. So today's Musée Rodin is the Hotel Biron, and Malvina was helping him catalog all of his works. In August, World War I came to Paris. Germany had declared war on Russia, and the French allies got involved, and they were mobilizing and coming into France. At that point, the city gates were closed, and everybody had to evacuate. But Rodin was told by the military that he needed to hide all of his work in the basement of the Biron Hotel. Malvina Hoffman helped him. She got some military people to help her find 6 strong men, and in several days they were able to hide all of his marbles and his bronzes and all of his work in the basement. And she did mention that the last time he saw them, when he all pushed together in the basement, rather than being shown as his legacy as a museum, he felt defeated and was crying and knew that the end of his life was near. It wasn't as he had planned. So they waited too long, Hoffman and her mother, to get out of Europe. All of the ships sailing from France were now stuck, were all full, and she couldn't get out. So they went to England and they asked Pavlova for help. They went to her Ivy House at Hampstead Heath. And Pavlova decided to smuggle Hoffman and her mother to America. What she did was she said they were in charge of all the sets and props going to America in 5 days shipping, and that's how they got there. Her company was going to follow a few months later, and so they had 5 days to kind of talk. It's at this time that the two women really solidified their friendship. They spent 5 days at Ivy House while war was ravaging around them, and stories and posters of bloody battles and the military losses were coming through. So the women kind of formed a cocoon around them and only talked about dance and their work and what they were doing and how to promote their work and how to keep earning income so that they could support their staff and their family. During this time, Pavlova decided to have Malvina Hoffman create her posters and her new playbills. And then she also was told about the idea Malvina had about the bas-relief. And Anna Pavlova said yes to this bas-relief. And at first glance, you wonder, why would she do that? That is a big project. But Pavlova really wanted, her dream was that after she was gone, her great legacy would continue. That was really what she was striving for. She wanted to be immortal in some ways. And she had been trying to do it on film, but back then film was new and rudimentary. And they couldn't capture the ballet in it. When they would show it, it was too slow, and they couldn't get the whole stage, and it just didn't look good. She did not give permission for anybody to show her films from the ballet. So she felt that this bas-relief would immortalize her in dance, and also she would have control over exactly what it looked like. So she agreed to do it. The project took 15 years to complete of the two women, and Anna Pavlova posed for about 10 of those. So during those 5 days, they actually began working on the drawings, and the two women together were doing what they do. Anna Pavlova was posing and doing dances and being very serious about how to get new posters and programs, and Malvina Hoffman was artist, taking it all in. So why the Bacchanal out of all the dances that Pavlova did? Janice Connor, who was the curator of the Malvina Hoffman estate at her death, believed that it was probably choreographed by Michael Fokine for Pavlova and Mordkin's appearance at a charity gala in the Paris Opera after the Ballet Russe first season in 1909. It was an erotic pas de deux, and it was wildly popular with audiences everywhere. In fact, Carl Van Vechten, who was the critic for the New York Times, said that in this pas de deux, Pavlova and Mordkin swept the audience almost literally out of their chairs, and Pavlova danced the Bacchanal with childlike glee. And probably one of the reasons why people weren't offended by it, like they were with L'Après-Midi du Faun, is because she did do it with such childlike glee that even though it was very sexual, it was done in a light, kind of a silly way. So it took a little bit of the edge off of it. Before the ship sailed to America, the two women got to work. And Malvina Hoffman didn't think that there would be another moment. It was almost too much for her to believe. And she said in her diary, "This sudden chance of a lifetime to catch a living, fluttering piece of antique beauty and have it willing, keen, sympathetic, responsive, my God, she can never know the relief to my soul. The long sufferer for desire gratified. She dances about the room, whirls, falls, and then tries again the Bacchanal poses. I rearrange the groups in the frieze, plan new ones, and study as if a vision before me should, for only one glance before the veil should fall, should disappear." So she took that time with Pavlova very seriously and wasn't really sure if they'd ever get together again. This is one of the program covers that Malvina Hoffman created for Pavlova, and it was used as a playbill, and they would just change the dates and the times. But as you can see, Pavlova again with this gorgeous photograph of her that's absolutely perfect. We know Malvina Hoffman created this program because the Bacchanal frieze is actually going through the name Pavlova, and Malvina Hoffman's copyright is underneath the frieze. So we do know that she did create this program for her. So let's talk about the war, because it was a big part of their lives, and it really was instrumental in some of the things that they had to do to keep going on. Anna Pavlova and her company hadn't left yet. It was many months before they were able to leave. She was a Russian citizen still, so she had to get papers so she could leave London. She couldn't go back to Russia. Russia was at war. And she couldn't have her ballet company dancing in Europe anymore because there was no work. So now Pavlova had to worry about how are my dancers going to earn a living. And so she set up schedules all over the world. She went to South America, she went to Asia, she went to India, she went to Australia, she went to New Zealand. And this was beginning in 1914. There were no planes, and there weren't a whole lot of roads. So the travel was difficult, and she was a woman doing all of this. So it was pretty profound. Malvina Hoffman did get back to New York, and she joined the Red Cross. Her sister was the head of the New York Red Cross, and Malvina became a translator. Now, although the U.S. was not at war at this time, the Red Cross was working with their allies in Europe, and so Malvina Hoffman was a translator and would take any messages that came from Europe that were in French and translate them. She also learned how to drive an ambulance, and she got a certificate that showed that she could take apart an ambulance and put it back together, which was pretty amazing. During this time, she had some very large commissions that she was working on, and she also was still working on the dance. One day, she heard somebody yelling her name, Malvinushka, up the stairs to her third-floor studio, and Anna Pavlova came running up the stairs with an armful of flowers, and they began work again on the Bacchanal. Now, they also did some other poses, not just the Bacchanal, and one of them was La Gavotte. And I'm very excited because we've got a nude study and also the bronze of La Gavotte. But we also have, thanks to Charlene, a photograph of Anna Pavlova actually posing in La Gavotte. So please take some time and look at that, because for me, it's very exciting to be able to see the ballerina and the two bronzes together. The two women spent a great deal of time together, and as Pavlova was performing on stage, Malvina would go and draw in the green room. She would come and pose during rehearsals. After rehearsals, after performances, Pavlova would go to her studio and work even late into the morning. And many times she brought some of the other dancers with her, including some of the male ballet dancers as well. So there was something about being able to pose that was very relaxing and calming for the ballerina. Malvina said this about her times with the ballerina at her studio posing. And then, against a green wall, standing, turning her torso as a flower turned towards the sun, smiling, young, naive, the pose from the Bacchanal before she falls, exhausted. I cannot draw a line, it is too much, but the impression, like a vision in my dream, will stay forever in my spirit. The bronze that you see on the screen is La Paris. It's not from the Bacchanal, but in it, you've got Novikov, the dancer, posing with Pavlova. And in it, if he kisses her, she dies. But he's allowed to dance with her and be with her, but he just can't kiss her. But she's irresistible, and he does kiss her, and she falls to the ground, and the lily falls out of her hand. And that's what you're looking at on this. But while they were actually creating this bronze, Novikov wanted to actually be posing kissing her, because he thought getting to kiss her for many, many hours was a good idea. But Malvina thought it was more interesting if it was that moment after the kiss. So poor Novikov, he was very unhappy about that. So after the war finally was ending, 1919 came along, and things were kind of getting back to normal. And two exciting things happened to Malvina Hoffman. One of them was that her Russian dancers was seen by Léonce Benedit, who was the curator of the Luxembourg Gardens and the Musée Rodin later. And he saw this in a Cleveland home as he was meeting somebody in Cleveland, and asked if he could put it in the Luxembourg Gardens. This was the greatest honor any sculptor could have in their lives. And of course, permission was granted by everybody involved. So in 1919, Malvina Hoffman became the first woman ever to be in the Luxembourg Gardens. And she also was only the second American in the Luxembourg Gardens. Now, the reason why, if any of you have been there, that you haven't seen her bronze there, because during World War II, when the Nazis were looting the Louvre and taking all of the great art out of Paris, they also took this sculpture, including the pedestal, and it's never been seen again. Another thing happened in 1919. Malvina Hoffman was asked by Herbert Hoover to, because she was so involved with the Red Cross, to go to Yugoslavia after the war and help him determine how to end mass starvation in Europe. One of the things people don't realize, especially probably in America, that the repercussions of war is starvation. And when Malvina said yes to this task, she didn't realize that what she was going to see was disease that goes along with starvation, and people that had no clothes, threadbare in their clothes. Most of the men were gone. It was mainly women and children that were left behind. And Malvina Hoffman was in 7 weeks in Serbia, Croatia, and she wrote a report and called her patrons back in New York and said, please send as much clothing as you can and raise as much money as you can for this effort. But Herbert Hoover took this information and came together with a plan to help end the mass starvation in Europe. So the work really began for the Bacchanal after this time, and the women started posing when they were together, and Malvina started drawing. On the left-hand side, I guess it's your left, is a clay of the actual several of the panels from the Bacchanal. Now, a sculptor does everything in drawing first because they want to see what they're going to be creating, and then they put it into clay, and then the clay is put into plaster. And in the plaster, that's where the mold is and the bronze is poured. So when you see the clay panels, this is before they became plaster, and the reason why that's important is because these don't exist anymore. The clay is destroyed during the plastering process. So, but you can see the absolute beauty of the movement in it. And there were 26 of these panels that they created over that 10-year period. This drawing is with Novikov, and it's a study for the 15th panel. This is one of the plaster panels from the 26 panel Bacchanal. Now, I will tell you that this it's never really been seen before, and it's only been viewed maybe 2 or 3 times in the history of its existence, and it's all in plaster. It never did get bronzed. During this 10-year period, both women had to travel for their work. It caused them months and months of separation. Anna Pavlova, from 1921 to 1925, traveled so much that they say she was actually performing 2 of those years on stage. And she was traveling all around the world. She was able to go back finally to Europe, but she literally never stopped performing. Malvina Hoffman was also traveling. She had studios in Paris and in New York. She went to North Africa to do some work for several months. And so they decided to photograph the 26 Bacchanal groups. For Anna Pavlova to allow these photographs of her, some of them in the nude, showed her great respect for the artist Malvina Hoffman, because she had to allow something that she controlled all the time to be in the hands of somebody else that she had no control over. So the 2 women had a great respect for each other. And actually, it was a time for Pavlova to let loose, and she would play with the camera, and she enjoyed doing it. After the 10 years of the 2 women working on the Bacchanal frieze, Anna Pavlova no longer had to pose. So it was a time when both women were actually allowed to kind of be together and rest together. Malvina Hoffman started doing some other studies of the ballerina, who was still her muse. One of his is my favorite is Anna Pavlova in marble. And this was when she was in her late 30s. And she's in repose, and she looks tired. This is a woman who never stopped working. So in this particular pose, it's almost as if she's reflecting back about her life, and she's a little sad and she's a little tired. The mask that you see is not a life mask, and it's not a death mask. It was actually sculpted, but it's erroneously called a life mask and sometimes a death mask. Now, Malvina Hoffman created with Pavlova the Farewell Tour program. And Pavlova never stopped dancing, but she did think that she might retire, so she had this Farewell Tour program that went with her when she traveled. And inside of it is the Bacchanal frieze, most of the panels. So again, you can see that Pavlova loved this project that she did and was proud of it, as was Malvina Hoffman. The front of the cover is a gilt panel from the Bacchanal frieze. The two women also now were able to spend some time together as friends, and Paul Warburg was one of the patrons of Malvina Hoffman, and he had an estate in New York, and he had cottages there. And in 1924, Anna Pavlova and Victor Dondre, her manager, who later became her husband, and Malvina Hoffman and her fiancé, Sam Grimson, who later became her husband, spent couple of summers together just resting. It was very playful. Actually, there's pictures of Anna Pavlova and Malvina Hoffman doing the Bacchanal, and it's a frightening picture. But in the pond is Malvina Hoffman's Boy with Panther Cub, and Anna Pavlova just relaxing in front of it. Despite their long periods apart, the two women were always in constant communication. And they wrote in French, and they sent telegrams and letters. The telegram that you see is actually Anna Pavlova in 1919. She's stuck in Buenos Aires, and the Russian Revolution is happening, and the United States won't let her in because she's a Russian citizen. But she has her dance company, and she needs to be able to work because she has overhead. And so she's pleading with Malvina to go to the State Department to help her get her company into New York, because otherwise she's going to have to release her dancers, and they've been with her for 5 years. So she didn't want to disband the company. And it must have worked because they continued dancing. And the lower letter on the right is a letter that she wrote during the war from Casablanca. She was there with her mother, trying to get her mother to France. And it's actually a letter just from one friend to another saying, gee, I haven't heard from you, we can't get any mail, this is what's happening. And it's more of just her telling her the news of what's happening in her life. Up at the very top, you'll see Malvina Hoffman's diary, and she talks about Pavlova's coming into town and what they're going to be doing and who they're going to be meeting. And whenever the two women were in Paris, London, or New York at the same time, they would always get together. Now, both women traveled, as I said, all over the world. Pavlova was in constant motion, and she went to Japan and India and all over the Asian continent. And so this is one of her dances that was inspired by the dances over in the other countries, and it's called Oriental Impressions. Malvina Hoffman also was obsessive about dance, and she traveled all over the world, and no matter what commission she was working on, excuse me, no matter what commission she was working on, she always made it a point to find the dancers, thank you, to find the dancers and draw them and sketch them and sometimes put them into bronze. So both women were very aware of dance around the world and very engaged in it. One of the other reasons why Malvina Hoffman traveled around the world is because in 1930 she was given the largest commission in the history of bronze art. To date, I believe it is still the largest commission. She was awarded a commission to bronze 105 life-size people from around the world for the Hall of Mankind for the Field Museum in Chicago. Now, this was not a small thing. What was happening in the 1920s with art and with women was, instead of going to competitions like the Paris Salon, galleries were starting to take over. And the galleries were won by men, and men weren't putting women in their galleries. So Malvina Hoffman was looking for a way to differentiate herself because she knew it was getting harder and harder to get into the galleries. Also at this time, the world was in a depression. And so the great commissions, the great huge commissions that she would get were no longer coming in. So this field museum kind of came at the right time for her to rebrand herself, I guess. And she was awarded $1.4 million in today's dollars, which was in 1930 the highest paid to any artist ever in the history of art. So, and she was a woman that a board of directors of all men hired. So the whole thing was pretty spectacular that she got this commission. Now they wanted it done in 3 years, which is probably insanity. And truthfully, I don't think there's an artist today, even with the modes of transportation, that could complete this in 3 years. Somehow Malvina did it. And she had 60 men in the foundries in Paris working to bronze and patina these 105 bronzes. So what she had to do, she first went to Paris, and she had to figure out how she was going to do this commission. And then she started working and finding people that the anthropologists from the museum, the different, as I'm using the word races, as they did back then, but just the different people from different places from around the world, cultures, that they wanted to put in this anthropological study. And so she was in Europe doing some of those planning, and in 1931, she was just getting ready to leave for her actual trip around the world. And Anna Pavlova came and said hello to her. She was on her way to Prague and wanted to meet with Malvina Hoffman. Malvina Hoffman said hello to her and was happy to see her. Victor Dandre was there, and Pavlova wasn't feeling too well. So they begged her to stay, and she said, no, I have to dance. I have a contract. I have to go. So she left for Prague. She left for The Hague, and she got stuck at a train platform, and it was in the middle of winter. And she was there for 4 hours, and by the time she got to The Hague, she was very, very ill and was diagnosed with pleurisy, which is similar to pneumonia. The doctor said she needed surgery, and if she didn't have the surgery, she would, if she did have the surgery, she would never be able to dance again. So she said no to the surgery. It was then a great shock to the world that Anna Pavlova died at the age of 49 at The Hague in January 1931. Known as the Dying Swan, it is said that on her deathbed, she said to her maid, get my swan costume ready. So Victor Dandre called Malvina Hoffman immediately, and she came to his side, and in London they had a Russian funeral for the ballerina. But Malvina Hoffman didn't stay. She was distraught. This was her beloved muse, her best friend, and she had to travel around the world to create these sculptures. So she immediately left and began her journey around the world. She went to Japan, and the Japanese were getting ready to invade China. And so there were soldiers everywhere. They were mobilizing. And every train she was on, every boat she was on, the Japanese soldiers were also following her there. She went up to the northernmost island of Japan to study the Ainu people, which probably don't even exist anymore. They were so ancient. And the only people ever to have seen them from America was Charles Lindbergh. So the two of them were the only people who had ever seen the Ainu. After that, she went to China, and on her boat was the Japanese cavalry and their horses. As she got to China, she got to go to Beijing, and she was there for 6 weeks, fell in love with China, just loved it. And she then had to travel back down to Shanghai. As she got down to Shanghai on her rickshaw to the hotel, the Japanese embassy was bombed by the Chinese as they were passing by. And so they realized they were in trouble here. So they had one person to sculpt while they were in Shanghai. They made him come immediately. He came to their room, and he actually posed in their hotel room. And at midnight, Malvina Hoffman, and there were three other people in her group, left for Hong Kong. That morning, the Japanese had destroyed the hotel, so she just barely got out. From the weather in the freezing cold winter weather in Japan, she then went to the South Pacific, and she started going into the jungles to do the Pygmy warriors and other headhunting tribes. And it was very different because back then, when she was out in the jungle, it was the real jungle. There were panthers, there were elephants, there were monkeys that kept throwing things at her. And it was hot, it was humid, and she was tired. She was 40 years old at this point. And so it was very difficult for her to do that and keep going. But she persevered, then went on to India, and then went back. And in 1933, the commission was completed at the Chicago Field Museum. And over the lifetime of it, over 10 million people went and saw that exhibition. One of the things that happened after Anna Pavlova died and before she went on her journey was Malvina Hoffman couldn't even mention her name. She couldn't talk about her. And as she set sail to go, she went through the US and then went to Asia. She went that way in her travels west. And she wrote in her diary finally, "To my beloved Anna Pavlova, my muse at the spirit of beauty." And then she began to write pages and pages of all of her memories of Anna Pavlova. So it's very painful for her to lose her beloved friend. What did their friendship really look like? These were two women who were sole providers for their staff and families. It was two women who were raised in the Victorian times when women had no authority or power. It was two women who worked together to promote their art and business. Both women were driven in their work. They demanded perfection. Hoffman's drive to create motion in bronze was inspired by the ballerina, who had an equal desire to perfect art through her dance. Art inspired both of them, but they expressed it in different forms. They planned and worked together to increase their receipts and increase their sales. They were always thinking about business throughout their friendship. I call them BFFs, best friends forever. Finally, after the Field Museum Commission was over, and it lasted, there was still work to do, so it lasted about another 2 years. Malvina Hoffman was able to put her efforts into some other types of things. One of them, she came up with an idea that was inspired by Anna Pavlova. The two of them had conspired and thought about doing this Dance International. It would be a dance exposition displaying dance from all over the world. Dance would be displayed in art forms covering the years 1900 to 1937, because that's when art and dance really became modern. Up until the 1900s, everything was classic, but with the Ballet Russe, everything changed to modern, and the dance you are doing today are actually a result of the Ballet Russe and what was happening in Paris at that time. So she really stuck with that time frame. The works of art were shown. There were motion pictures of dance. There was a film festival, and photographs for everybody to see. It premiered October 10th, 1937 at Radio City Music Hall. And again, it was a tribute to the ballerina. Mayor LaGuardia opened the Dance International, and it was front page news in New York. It lasted 6 weeks. And they showed Pavlova's Dying Swan for the first time. There were 2,000 items of dance from 40 countries. There were films of Isadora Duncan and Diaghilev's Ballet Russe. And Nijinsky, unfortunately, he suffered from schizophrenia, but he still drew ballet, pictures of the ballet in the asylums, so those were also on display. For the first time ever, the Bacchanal frieze was shown in its entirety. And also, Malvina Hoffman, as part of her Field Museum Hall of Mankind, she spent 2 months in New Mexico working with the Native Americans down there. And her friend Mabel Dodge was actually married to one of the tribal leaders. So during that time, she was invited to come and see all of the different dances. So she necessarily had the Native American dancers come and dance during Dance International. And of course, they were Degas bronzes of dancers, which were fabulous. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday for the 6-week periods, they had standing room only recitals. So it was a very exciting time. What else was happening with Dance International? Martha Graham performed. The Picasso Ballet, which was created by Jean Cocteau, who was a very avant-garde poet and writer. He also choreographed this dance, and he had Picasso create cubist sets for the Ballet Russe dance. And they did show it in its entirety during this Dance International. Most of the events were sold out, as I said, and it overflowed to Rockefeller Center. This was Hoffman's tribute to Anna Pavlova, and it fulfilled a dream the two of them had shared, because they studied dance from all over the world, and they knew that it was important. In fact, Malvina Hoffman said this: "The purpose of our effort is an educational one. We're seeking not simply to encourage friendly competition in art, but to bring together the different countries in some fundamental harmony of thought and interest." Here's a picture of some of the dancers from it, and you'll also see Ruth St. Denis in the front, Martha Graham, Paul Whiteman, and Doris Humphrey are in the front row. And I do want to take a moment at this time to say it's not lost on me that I am here at Vibe because Charlene called me about a picture she had from Malvina Hoffman and wanted to know a little bit more about the picture. And she didn't know about Dance International, I don't think, and I didn't know about Vibe. And as I started working on this program, it became clear to me that Vibe is the same tribute to Anna Pavlova that Malvina Hoffman was creating. This is what these two women dreamed about would happen with dance, that it would bridge the gap of the whole world and show that dance could bring people together. And so I feel very honored to be here, and I think that there's a higher level connection why I'm here. Just really very moved by the whole thing. So Dance International was such a great success that the New York City World's Fair invited Malvina Hoffman to create a colossal, as you can see it's colossal, fountain and dedicated to international dance. So it shows many different dances from around the world on the cylinder, and it was so thought out that the reflecting pool at the bottom at night would show the entire cylinder on it, so you could see it reflecting in its entirety. It was the focal point of the World's Fair. No matter where you walked, you had to walk by it. When the World's Fair was over, the city of New York didn't know what to do with it, so they demolished it, and it became rubble, and now it is a sidewalk in New York. That is a true story.
Terrible.
So these two women, I love them both, and they are, I wish they both were known for not only their great art, but just for who they were as important people and women in history, in women's history, in art history. And both of them traveled during a time which travel was not only extremely difficult, it was almost impossible. These women were not going on the grand tour and drinking champagne. They were traveling with people behind them that they were responsible for. They had to be financially responsible for the outcome of their travels. And it was so unusual that Malvina Hoffman actually did her Hall of Mankind travels around the world, that every newspaper in whatever city or town she was in, major city, they were writing about it because nobody had ever done anything like that before. Both women were focused on dance during their travels, Pavlova as the dancer and Malvina as a witness to dance and a sculptor. Both were business women before women could even vote. So just imagine how many glass ceilings that they shattered. I will say that they were well aware of the suffragette movement going on, and Malvina was asked to participate in the suffragette movement by Ida Sedgwick Proper, I'm getting that wrong, I'm so sorry. Ida Sedgwick Proper, who was an artist and head of pretty much running the United States suffragette movement. But Malvina felt that it distracted from her work. She went to a couple meetings and said, you know what, it's more important for me to do my work and be successful at my work. So she fought for women's rights that way because she actually had to earn a living to support her family and staff. I also wanted to show, this is Mongolian dancer. When she was in China, she was sick in bed. She hadn't rested enough and got very sick. And so these dancers came to her room dressed with peacock feather hats and danced around the room. And this particular fellow would grab Malvina's hand and would smile and say, "Mama sick, mama sick, mama sick." So she fell in love with him and created this bronze, and it's won many awards. It's absolutely beautiful. In 1937, right before Dance International, Malvina Hoffman was given the greatest award a woman could achieve at the time by the American Women's Association. It was the gold medal for eminent achievement. And nobody knows who's going to win it when they're about to award it. And in the audience were Pearl Buck, Georgia O'Keeffe, and a past winner had been Amelia Earhart. And Malvina Hoffman was given the award by her friend Pearl S. Buck. And Malvina Hoffman had this to say when she received it. "We believe that the way to world peace is through the shared vision of beauty or awakened sense of universal impulses beneath the various forms of artistic expression." And I feel that Vibe USA also has the same beliefs, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm very proud to be here, and it's been an honor to introduce you to Malvina Hoffman. And please tell everybody you know about this amazing artist, because I don't want her to be forgotten anymore. I'd like her to be in her rightful place in history. And the bronzes and the drawings that you see here were all part of the 10-year period that they worked on the Bacchanal frieze together. Thank you.
Dee Dee, thank you so much. That was just a wonderful and outstanding presentation and a fascinating, fascinating story of amazing lives. So I'll turn now to Charlene and to hear more about this connection between you two.
Well, I know that next year I could do an entire event just about my mother and her experiences that would tie into everything Dee Dee has said too. So to briefly bring this full circle, which is why I'm here, the picture on your far left, where from the frieze where they're bending backwards, about a year ago, because my home and my basement and my life has actually been cluttered with great treasures from my family. And I've had just a miraculous, very lucky childhood, unusual, very similar to some of the ladies you've heard from today in my roots in Chicago. But we finished Vibe USA, and that picture was in my dining room, and I've been carrying that thing around for, you know, from Chicago to Los Angeles to Montana. And I really didn't know what that picture is. But it is among my treasures from my mother, my family, and Radio City Music Hall. And I had been given great detail on many of the things I had received from my family. And I have Vincent Minnelli drawings that were, he was the costume designer at Radio City Music Hall. And all these things that had been explained to me, but not this. And not the photograph that she had casually said, well, yes, that's Pavlova. So I thought, well, I guess it's not that important. After Vibe USA, really tired, I thought, I'm just going to walk over and take a look at what the heck that thing is. Went to my computer, plugged in Malvina Hoffman, and went to Facebook, and there it was, the page for Malvina Hoffman, and that's the image that I have in my dining room. So I quickly wrote on the Facebook Messenger, I have that image. And I went to bed at 2 in the morning. Well, it's 8 a.m. I have a message from Dee Dee. Oh my goodness! How? Where? Why? And I hadn't told her my background, and then I started to say, my mother had danced at Radio City Music Hall, and she had been a great, great ballerina, prima ballerina at Radio City Music Hall following World War II. And she also had been, a child of the Depression, French family, oldest of 4 girls, and had a very difficult time deciding how she was going to become a ballerina, but very similar to these Pavlova stories and everything else. By George, she got to New York and she got the job, and she replaced Nora Kay, who left and became a great ballerina elsewhere. It's miraculous that these women not just thrived, but survived throughout the ages. And at Radio City Music Hall right after World War II, besides a romantic thing, my father had served in World War II too, and was a violinist and a filmmaker and a wonderful writer. He was working across the street at the NBC, and so they had a stage door Johnny love affair, and they began to collect these great treasures in their life through music, through art, through film, through dance. And by the time it was early 60s and I was a little girl, I was old enough now that they would start taking me to Radio City to see the Christmas show and the Easter show. And you must realize that there was no Balanchine yet, there was no Joffrey, there was no American Ballet Theater. So Radio City Music Hall truly was the showplace of our nation. And they were never well known for doing Swan Lake Nutcracker or Sleeping Beauty. It was original ballets. It was original ballets for a huge audience. Millions and millions of people came here. So it shaped what would become Las Vegas, what would become the Joffrey, what would become American Ballet Theater. It was the beginning of American ballet, really. And these artists that were Malvina Hoffman or Vincent Minnelli, Judy Garland's husband, they worked at Radio City Music Hall. This was their early lives too. So when my mother got her job in the ballet company, she also became friends with the choreographer, and the choreographer's name was Margaret Sandy. Margaret Sandy was a former Ziegfeld Follies girl and was considered the original American jazz dancer with Jack Cole. Well, Margaret Sandy liked my mother very much, probably because she worked harder than anybody else, and she was very beautiful. She hadn't had much training, but she was very beautiful, and she very rapidly rose up through the ranks. My mother also had an interest in choreography. So she would help Miss Sandy, and there was no labo notation or ways to write down the choreography. My mother helped her write it down. It's very similar to these stories, and I didn't know that much until today. I have the notes of those ballets from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that were treasures of Miss Sandy's and were given to my mother. So when I saw this, my first call was Dee Dee, and then she asked me how I had it, and I said, it came to me through this choreographer at Radio City Music Hall, and then through my mother, along with many other treasures that Miss Sandy has passed through my family. My next call was Radio City, and I said, I just talked to Malvina Hoffman's family, and the archivist there said, oh my goodness, that was the biggest exhibition at Radio City Music Hall. And I said, and by the way, I have the notes from Miss Sandy's ballets. So I flew to New York to meet with Radio City. And this has really opened up, I don't know yet, for the future, because most of us, and I'm sure everyone in here, when you think Radio City Music Hall, if you think Radio City Music Hall, would think the Rockettes, right? So this was the ballet, and there's not many stories about the ballet, but the ballet was great. It was great. And so this treasure came down to me through Miss Sandy, who also staged Rhapsody in Blue, and these huge monumental productions. Miss Sandy has passed away, and what's ironic about all of this, I was at Radio City Music Hall in the late 70s. And when my parents came to see me at Radio City, there were still people working there that, there was the milliners and the shoe people, and they thought I looked like my mother, and many of them were elderly. They were in their 90s, and they were still working there. It was a family place. People stayed there their whole lives, and my mother always was happy that she never had to tour, that she could stay in New York and not have to tour and have a family, etc. So, ironically, all these years later, here I am in Montana. And I must say that my work is definitely shaped, not just by me and my mother, but these women that came before. All of these collaborations were not a choreographer isolated thinking about making a new ballet. It was instrumental that they met the filmmaker, the composer, the choreographer, the Diagoli of ballets. We could talk about those endlessly. But these treasures from Miss Sandy, it's just crazy that now they're with me, and they're at Rocky Mountain Ballet Theater. Our little children who do the undersea ballet, when Disney came in and took over in the late 70s Radio City, there's been many, pages of history of Radio City Music Hall. I happened to be there at the time, and they literally was like a garage sale. I was in the basement saying, I'll take the undersea scarf if nobody wants it, and I'll take the hot pink shoes from the disco number, and the, anything that I could bring. And I brought them home to Chicago because my mother had a school at the time. And then here I've come to Montana, and I've brought some of those treasures with me too. So New York is New York, right? It's New York for the United States. Montana, I've made it my life's work to bring those stories to our next generation of children and to represent Montana wherever we go with this new work. And so we're going to wrap it up. And these photographs across the front, the parents who study with me, their children pass by these all the time. And when they get to a certain age, I take them by the hand and point out my mother and these various things, and the undersea scarf that's in there, and the movie stars that came in here. Bugsy Siegel's girlfriend is down here, and all of the treasures of the stories. But I guess to just wrap it up, it's a full circle. It's a full circle. And thank you, Dee Dee.
We literally have about 2 minutes for questions. If you really need to leave at 1 sharp and we go a minute over, please don't hesitate to go ahead and leave if you have your schedule to keep. But I'd love to allow for a couple questions. This has been a fascinating morning into the afternoon. Anybody have one? Yes.
I just have one question. Did the Ballet Russe ever perform in the United States? Because one of the stories from my family was my father's younger brother had danced with the Ballet Russe. And of course, by the time I knew him, he was a much older man, and I never thought to ask him about that the 2 times I actually met him.
Did everyone hear the question all right?
Yes, and do you live in Missoula, or are you visiting for Vibe?
No, I live in Superior, but I
Okay.
grew up in Massachusetts.
So among my treasures at home, I have all these Ballet Russe programs. Yes, and I think they did travel here. I'll just get them out, but they're all in English, and my mother had them all autographed from all the great dancers.
I think that in the 30s, my
Right.
father was born in 1914, and Walter was his younger brother, so I would think like maybe, so I was thinking mid to late.
I think they did. I'll bring them in. I mean, and there's Chagall's drawings all over everything. Everything is just layered with art.
I mean, I don't know that he was ever a principal dancer, I just don't know that much, but I guess it was just always something, he lived in New York and we grew up in Massachusetts, but I just always heard that he had danced with
Right. And last year we had Patricia Wilde here, who danced with the Ballet Russe, and so, I'll call Pat and ask her.
Dee Dee, question. I missed the very beginning of this. Are you associated to Malvina, or how did you come about?
Thank you for asking. Thank you for asking. My husband is Malvina Hoffman's great nephew. The way I learned about him was when we first started dating, I went to his home, and it was filled with these magnificent bronzes. And I couldn't believe how gorgeous they were. And he told me her name, and I'd never heard of her. And I felt that I knew art history, but I couldn't believe that I never heard of her. And so that's how I began to study her. And like Anna Pavlova to Malvina Hoffman is my muse. So she just is with me all the time. Thank you.
Where are the all the life-size figures from the Hall of Mankind now? Are they still?
They're still at the Field Museum, and in fact, they brought 50 of them up in January for a retrospective. And but they put it all the way in the back. It was so hard to get to that I don't even know how people could find it. What happened with the Field of Man was in the 1960s. The civil rights movement came to Chicago, especially. It was very loud, and the Black Panthers said that it was a racist exhibition, and so the Field Museum, instead of saying, no, that's not what it was. It was an anthropological, it's ethnological, and look at these bronzes. They're magnificent. They hid all of the sculptures in the basement, and they've been there for 40 years. Mm-hmm. And so they brought 50 of them out, and they still tiptoe around the conversation. They won't have a real conversation about it. But Malvina Hoffman loved these people, and I think it's important for me to say that Anna Pavlova and Malvina Hoffman felt that everybody in the world was one, especially Malvina Hoffman. She writes about it. She thinks we all come from the same source. And in her bronzes is the humanity, which makes them so beautiful. You know, each and every one of them had a name, and they were all important to her. And actually, when the Field Museum hid these bronzes because they were afraid of people calling it racist, and and now if you look at Malvina Hoffman, it'll say racist next to her name, which just drives me crazy. I'm trying to change that story. The Malcolm X College actually took 20 of them and had them on display for, I don't know, about 20 years because they were so beautiful. So that's what happened to them, and now they're back buried again in the Field Museum basement.
One last question?
Thank you.
Anybody? Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to our guest speakers today. Beautiful job. Thank you.
Thank you.